So next we're going to do the bracing. That's the angled braces that go between the end wall post and the post next to it. And this will ensure that your end walls are nice and plumb. And that's one of the more important things to do as far as any leveling or plumbing that you have to do in these buildings, is you want your end walls nice and straight so that way your doors and everything will work as they should. Alright, you start with the same brackets that you used on the hoops for the braces on there. You just bend these open a little, just kind of push them on. Same way we did before. Go ahead and put one on the post from the end wall and the one on the end wall post. Then you take, this is the brace, and this is just going to go catty corner like this. We'll start with the lower, which is this one here. We'll go ahead and get a bolt through it and just get it snugged up. Make sure that you put your nut to the inside and the carriage head of the bolt to the outside. So this way, if you ever have to adjust this, you can get to it, because there will be a baseboard that'll be over this or nearly over it. It'll make it harder in the future if you ever have to make any repairs or adjustments. Squeeze that together. If you can't get it squeezed together by hand, you can use a pair of pliers or something. There you go. Same size bolts and nuts as before. Leave that where that will still slide up and down, and then we'll go ahead and do the other side. Take your level and check this for plumb. Now you're going to want to be careful if you're using a long level like I have here, because it could give you a false reading. It will give you a false reading if you have it against this bracket. So you're going to want to make sure you hold this lower and kind of hold it slightly to the side or something about like that. Now that one this wall needs to come right back this direction just a little bit. So I'm going to go ahead and snug up the bottom one. You're going to want to put this, you need a hammer handy too. You're going to want to put this bracket toward the bottom. If you put it up real high, then it's going to put this in too high, and that's going to get in the way of your baseboards and your hip boards. So you're going to want to make sure you put this a little lower. And that's really just how I like that setup on this model of a high tunnel. Different high tunnels will be a little bit different on how the hip and baseboards are done. So this is kind of just varies depending on what you have. All right, once you have that nice and tight, you put another self-drilling screw through the bracket. And you only got to put one in here, the same way we did on the hoops. This is just to keep it from possibly sliding or working around later on in time. Now to get this one correct, you kind of just lean against it and then just tap this up or down. You tap it down, it's going to push it out. You tap it up, it's going to pull it in. So you just use that until you get it plumb. And there, I got that side. So then just tighten this down, put a self-drilling screw in the same way we did the bottom. Do the same thing on the other 4 sides and you'll be done. All right, now we're going to do the hip and baseboards. To do the hip and baseboards properly, it's the hip boards you got to make sure. The hip board's the top, the baseboard's the bottom. Another thing, I am going to be using metal hip boards. It's a thin metal, about, I don't know, 16 or 18 gauge. And it's galvanized. I like them the best. They're a pretty good price from Zimmerman's, where I got the high tunnel. I don't think it really comes out any higher to go metal than what it does treated lumber. If you're not going to use metal baseboards or hip boards and you're going with a different brand high tunnel or you're building yours from scratch, you'll probably be going with wood. It's more common. You can either use treated or you can go with like Western cedar or something that's rot resistant. Personally, I would go with the cedar because I don't trust treated wood that close to where you're going to be growing produce. I mean, they probably claim it doesn't leach in, but there have been issues with other treated lumbers leaching into soil in the past, so I just don't like to take the chance. So, if you're going to be using that, you basically just use lumber the same way I'm going to be doing this. You're just going to be using different fasteners, and so that's about the only difference. It's pretty much just the same thing otherwise. So there's a few steps that you'll just want to skip. It'll be pretty obvious on which those will be. So we're going to start with the hip boards, which is the top. I'm not starting by putting them on. I'm going to start by figuring out where I'm positioning them. Then I'll know where to position my baseboard to make sure I don't put them too low or too high. So I'm going to start by, this isn't one of the hip boards. This is a splice that goes in them to connect them. But it's pretty much the same size. So what I'm going to do is, I'm going to hold my level up here. Now, you kind of just hold it to where it's flat along this line here, because it's curved so it's not going to sit on there completely. And then I'm going to hold this up to here. And so that way I know when my plastic's pulling off the hip board, when it's hooked in on there, that it isn't going to be dipping down between the hoops. If it's too low, then that can kind of cause you problems. We've had this happen before when the directions weren't very clear. And so this time we're making sure we get this right. So just hold your level there. Put your splice or a piece that's the same size. If you're using lumber, just use a scrap piece or something. Set that there, and then once you get that where it looks like a straight pole, go ahead and slide it up. Move this. Go ahead and slide this up just a little bit more, maybe a ½ inch or something. I just kind of eyeball it. Now, then you're going to take a Sharpie and just use a permanent marker, or if you have whatever marks it best for you, and just put a line here. And that'll be your bottom, and then that'll be your top. Now those are going to be your reference lines now for measuring the distance down to the baseboard. And so we're going to go and measure that, and we'll get that figured out, and then we're going to start connecting. Alright, now I'm going to measure my distance. That will be in between the hip and the baseboard. And so what I'm going to do is, I've decided to go with 46 inches in between. The distance between them varies on your wall height and kind of just on how you want to do it. And so 46 is what's going to work best for me. And so it's just simple. You just measure from your mark we just put on from the bottom of the hip board, and you just measure that on down. Move the baseboard out a little. Go and measure that down, and then we'll just put a mark at 46 inches. And now, let me put a mark here, just like that. Now you're going to want to be careful not to put your baseboard just straight against the ground. And the reason why is, if the ground you're building on is not entirely level or has light curve to it, then you're going to end up having to dig down and stuff in order to get them all the way down. So you're best off just to raise them off the ground at least 2 inches, maybe even 4 or more, and then you can just backfill along it later on once you're done. That's really the easiest process to do it over having to possibly dig down. It just saves you a lot of time in the long run. And that few inches difference won't make any difference on your walls or anything when they roll down. So, just going to hold this here. You want to, just going to use, you can either use a straight edge, or I'm just going to use this piece again. You want your hip and your baseboard both to be flush with the outside of your post here. You don't want it in the middle, you want flush with the outside. This way it lines up better with your end walls once you put them on. So we'll make sure that's flush there, just by doing that. And then I'll just have to pick this up here, and you can use a clamp or something. And how the steel ones are held on, and you'll do the same with wood, is I'm just going to drill a hole all the way through the baseboard, and this is the same process for the hip boards. On the ends here, you drill a hole all the way through the post, and then you just put a carriage bolt all the way through. Now, something I've started doing with these metal ones is, when you want to tighten this down, it just wants to crush these in. And that's no good. So what I start doing is taking some old pieces of plumbing pipe, or you can buy some, and I cut spacers. And the spacers are 1.5 inches for this baseboard it is. And I just put that in there like that. The bolt goes on through, and then you can tighten it down nice and tight, and you don't worry about crushing your baseboards in or your hip boards on the ends. It worked really well last time, and so I'm going to do that again. Alright, we got the other end of this baseboard blocked up so that way it sets about level. It doesn't have to be perfect. Like I said, make sure the end's flush, and we're going to go ahead and drill our hole right through. This is just a single carriage bolt straight through. Yours might be different. It might take more. Once you have your hole drilled through the board, then you can go ahead and mark your hole on the post. And then once you got the hole marked on the post, it's easier to go ahead and drill it than once your board's out of the way. Whenever you're drilling at an angle like this on a pipe, start by drilling straight, and then once you get your hole started, you can angle your drill slowly, and that'll keep your bit from walking. Put the pipe spacer on if you're using the metal boards. Now, once I have it on there, since this is a carriage bolt, it has that square shoulder on it that'll keep it from rotating. So once you got it in place there, just give it a little hit with a hammer. That sets that shoulder into the metal, and that'll keep it from rotating on you. You'll want to do the same thing if you're using wood. Just give it a hit with a hammer, it drives that square shoulder in, and that way your bolt will not rotate on you as you're tightening. Go ahead and put your nut on the back side. Now I can tighten that down real nice and hard, and it didn't crush it in at all. Alright, since we have the baseboard mounted on the one end with the single bolt, before you get started on the rest of it, you have to determine its height in comparison to the rest of the building. You can't use a level because the level is not going to be accurate since we're going downhill. So the easiest way to do this is to measure from your baseboard you have on here to this seam here, this joint. And that for me is 37 inches and 3/4. Now this will vary depending on how your baseboard's mounted and where it's mounted. Now, since these posts may not all be exactly the same, this isn't a perfect measurement, but it's close enough for the hip and baseboards. They do not have to be that accurate. And you'll notice if one's off too much because it's just not going to want to bend. If you're using wood or metal, it's just not going to be that flexible. And so you'll just kind of go off that. These are just going to be your rough guide to know where you're at. And so the easiest way to do this, though, instead of measuring it every one as you go, I just go on ahead. And like I said, this was 37 3/4. So I go on ahead and just measure 37 3/4 down every post on this side then. And so then I'll go ahead and just take my marker, mark the bottom on where that's supposed to be, and I'll just measure every single post. And so that way, all I gotta do is just line it up with my magic marker mark and then screw in place. I don't have to mess with the tape measure while I'm working. All right, we have all of our marks on here. And so we just hold that up to there. And then while that's being held up, we just put a bracket on from the back and just hold it close to your line. Once you get a screw in here, then you can slide it up and down before you put in your final screws. Don't tighten those down either until you get the other side in, because if you do, your screw's not going to reach on the other side because these brackets kind of get sucked in there as they tighten. So just start this screw where it's threaded in, and then go ahead and do the other side. Same thing, just where it's threaded in part way. Now, since that'll hold itself in, you can slide that up to where it needs to be and then tighten it from there. This is the same thing you would do if you're using wood baseboards. You would just use a small lag bolt or a deck screw or something along that lines to hold it instead of these self-drillers. Now, these self-drilling screws, since this metal is a little bit thin, they will strip out very easily. So you want to make sure when you're drilling them tight, you don't overdo it. You're just going to want to tap them until it's tight. If you really hit it too hard, you'll just strip them out right off the bat. And then there's another screw here that comes through this hole here in the side. And that'll keep them from ever dropping and holds their position and height. The legs are much thicker still. You can tighten the screws down a lot harder. If you over tighten them, you'll actually break the screw off first, most likely. So you also don't want to do that. All right, we just do the same thing again and put the bracket on the bottom now. This is for joining together the metal boards. And if you're going to be using wood, then you'll just join the ends together however you see fit. But since I'm using the metal ones, they come with these. They're just slightly smaller, so they slide right inside. Just slide them in approximately halfway. You don't have to measure if you don't want. Make sure when you drive your screws in, we're just putting screws in. I think we're going to put about 2 in each side, here and here. You don't want them on the front because that's going to get in the way of your curtain later on when you're going to be putting zigzag channels, what I'm going to be using on there, or whatever your fasteners are going to be. You're just not going to want them in the way. You're not going to want these in the way of your fasteners for your curtains or your side plastic or whatever you're going to put up there. So that'll also, when you do put your curtains on, then you will have screws going through, so they will also be holding these together in time. But for now, we're just going to put 2 in each side on top, and that way we can make sure that this is pushed tight against the front. Or the next board you put on, if this is back like that, then the next baseboard is going to sit back in, and that's going to leave a drop there, and that's no good. So make sure that's to the front. All right, that should be enough. If you feel like you want to put another screw in the back or something, then that's up to you, but I'm just putting the 2 in the top. And then, like I said, when the rest of the curtain goes on, there'll be more screws to the front to hold it. So that should solve any problems you have. Now, we just take the next baseboard, just slide it on. That easy. You're going to kind of want to make sure you get them. If there's a little bit of a drop here like that, that's not going to hurt anything in the long run. You won't even be able to see it, and it really doesn't matter. But get them up there as tight as you can to each other. And just put 2 more screws in. See, that is moving a little bit more than maybe what I want. Well, it's just going to be sitting here until we get the rest of the screws in. So I think I will go ahead and just put 2 screws into the back. All right, now that we have the baseboard on, you can see that the lines really are, the lines that you measured right on there really are just kind of for a reference. Because you'll kind of just go off on how your board is. If the board seems like it needs to bend a lot to get there, then that line's probably off because one of your posts is sitting a little bit lower than it should be. That doesn't hurt anything, just don't make any drastic changes from one post to the other on height or where it sits against the post or if the post is a little bit away from it. I have one down here where the post sits away from it slightly. I'll show you how pretty soon to put a bolt instead of the self-drillers that they give you, and just to put spacers in there to just fill that out so it doesn't suck it in, because you want to just kind of stay even the whole way down the entire side. Otherwise it'll mess up your curtain later on. It's not a big deal. I'll show you how to fix that here pretty soon. But now we're moving on to the hip boards. And the hip board is the exact same process as the baseboard. You probably will need somebody to help you hold it in place, but it just goes straight up here to where we already have our marks. And we'll do the same process of marking that we did on the lower. You just measure up from the seam instead of down. And so it's not a big deal, and also you can kind of tell because it's going to want to sit over the arch at a certain spot. If it's way off, you'll notice it not wanting to sit the same. So once again, you just kind of a little bit of its eyeballing and just get it straight in comparison to the rest. You can measure your distance between the hip and baseboard once in a while if you want, and make sure you have it right. Same process, you go ahead and drill your hole through here, and you have the carriage bolt in both ends, and then you have the brackets with the self-drillers on the rest. And it's the same process with the wood as I said before. Now what I did forget to mention before is the baseboards are the equivalent of a 2x6, and the hip boards are the equivalent of 2x8s. The hip boards need to be wider because you're going to have the curtain assembly on the bottom half, and then your if you're using zigzag wire or boards or whichever you decide to use on your high tunnel to attach your main film over the top. And so it's got to have enough room to accommodate both of those. So it's a wider board. Now the hip board and baseboards are on. You just got to trim off the excess from the ends. You normally have about 1.5 or 2 foot extra. And so once again, it's with steel. It's the same process for wood. So if you have a roofing square handy or a tri-square, you can just go ahead and just mark this and cut it. Now when you cut it, you want it to be flush with the outside of the pipe on your end wall. And so make sure you don't cut it too far back because you want that to be flush so it all lines up when you go to put the end of your wall on and the plastic and everything over that. So if you don't have a square handy, I don't have one with me right now, so I'm going to use a tape measure. You just measure back. You just measure back to where it is flush with it. And mine's looking like 25.5 inches. So I'll go ahead and put a mark at 25.5. Then I'll go ahead and mark 25.5 on the bottom. And you can also, for that matter, you can go ahead and look and see if it's the same. Because being you want to be flush with the outside of this, if your baseboard or hipboard's sloping slightly, it might not actually be square. And actually when I look at that, this is closer to 25 3/8 on the bottom. An eighth of an inch isn't really enough to matter if you're using a square, so you don't have to really worry about that much, but it is an adjustment you can make if you're not using the square. Then go ahead and just hang your tape measure down and line that up. Just get yourself a rough mark there. Now, go ahead and grab, I'm using a reciprocating saw. You can also use an angle grinder with a cutoff wheel or a circular saw with an abrasive cutoff wheel. Either of those are really good options. The circular saw is probably about the easiest to get a good straight cut. Other than that, just about whatever works. If you don't have any of those, a hacksaw works really good too. This isn't a very thick metal, so it cuts real quick with a hacksaw. Now careful and still, even though we measured this, you're going to kind of want to just eyeball it because you don't want to get into your pipe. You'll just knock the galvanized off, and then that'll give you a chance of having a spot that might want to rust later on. Now, I got off my mark a little bit on spots here. That's easily fixed by either a file, or you can just use a grinder with a sanding wheel or something on it like that. So that's not a big deal, and it'd be the same with wood. If you're out a little bit, you can use a rasp or just some sandpaper or something to clean it down. Or you might be able to just take your saw and just kind of nibble it off with that too. Another thing you might want to do is take a file if you're doing steel and just go over the edges with a file or sandpaper and kind of clean those up. And that's kind of just for a safety reason, so when you're working on this, you don't bump into it and cut yourself. Now just repeat that same process on the baseboard, and then on the baseboard and hipboard on the other wall. Once the hip and baseboards are on, you've got to put a filler board in here, or in my case a steel bar, depending on if you're going with metal or wood. It just needs to be a piece of material that's the same width or thickness as your hip and baseboard, and then the same height as the in-between space. And the only point of this is you just put this in here using a couple of these L brackets, and then that gives you something to tack your side curtain pockets to. So it's an easy process, won't take a few minutes. Alright, now that you got your hip and baseboards on, you will probably have one like this where when you go to put your bracket on, it sets out too far. Now, the easiest way to solve that I found is, instead of, because if you pull this tight with screws, it's going to warp in your base or hip board, and that's going to cause you problems down the road. So you want to keep these straight even if the pole's in. So the easiest way to fix this is go to your hardware store and buy some 2-inch self-drilling, self-tapping screws. These are about the exact same size as the others, or a little bit coarser thread, they're just long. And then I'm using, you can use about whatever's handiest for you, but I'm using 3/8 inch steel brake line. I bought this from an auto parts store. Any decent auto parts store should carry this. You just buy it by the foot. And so what you do is, go ahead and start by screwing the bracket to the post. Not through the hip and baseboard, just through the side hole here. Hold it where it's even on each side. Go ahead and tighten that up. That's going to make it a lot easier instead of trying to hold everything together while you're getting the length of your pipe. Now, instead of using a tape measure or something, you could But it's easier just to go ahead, hold your pipe up here, and just put a little marker mark in it. Now you're going to need a small tubing cutter. If you don't have one, they're not very expensive and they're handy to have, so I just suggest just buying one. And there's also, if it's just a small space like this, you could even just go get washers if you want and then just stack up washers. That's a good alternative. But some of them you might have even an inch, inch and a half to clear, and then you're going to have more than that. Your other option could even be buying some nuts that were bigger and then using the nuts as spacers. And there's my spacer. Just stick that down through there. You might need pliers to hold it in place. You might have to get some needle nose pliers if it's a thin one. There we go. Stick it on like that. And there you go. And then just do the other side the same way. And if your bracket's not entirely straight on there, one side's farther out than the other, then that's also not a big deal. Just put a little bit of a longer spacer in there, just hold it up there, marker with a marker, the same way I showed you on the first one.